Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I will tell you about the HOA that called 911 against me. I can still remember the exact moment my phone started buzzing uncontrollably that afternoon. I was knee-deep in my new landscaping project, wearing old jean shorts and a tank top splattered with potting mix. The sun was fierce, and I was completely engrossed in setting up a row of dwarf shrubs I'd bought at a local nursery. A neighbor from across the street was flagging me down, yelling something about people gathering in front of my house. At first, I had no idea what was going on. My house sat on a sizable lot in a friendly enough neighborhood, and I had never expected to see a small crowd formed on the sidewalk. So, curiosity piqued, I walked around my garage to investigate. And there I saw a few folks in matching polos glaring at me with alarmed expressions. I didn't recognize them, and they did not look pleased. It's an understatement to say that everything changed for me in that moment. A bit of background here. I'd purchased my home from a retiree who was downsizing. The property had originally been part of a larger subdivision, but years ago, the city's zoning lines were redrawn. While most houses on my street fell under a common homeowners association, my specific property was technically exempt. I found out about this loophole after my real estate attorney gave me a thorough breakdown of local property records. The way he described it, the lines of that HOA basically ended a few streets over, skipping right over my backyard. The previous owner confirmed as much. He'd never paid a dime in HOA fees, never attended any of their meetings, and never had any issue with it. That was great news for me. I'm not a huge fan of strict neighborhood rules. Still, I guess the folks I saw on the sidewalk that day, who turned out to be the board members of the association, hadn't gotten the memo or simply refused to accept it. When I approached to see if everything was all right, one of them, a stern woman in her late 50s named Eleonora, gave me the meanest look. The conversation started as a friendly introduction, but quickly shifted when she demanded to know why I was making unapproved changes to my landscaping. I told her plainly that I wasn't in the HOA, so I didn't need approval. She scowled, turned to her companions, and spat out something about, "Everyone is bound by the same covenant." Confused, I politely asked her to show me where exactly it states that my house fell under their jurisdiction. Eleonora stammered, stepped back, and snapped that her records must be updated. That's when I began to suspect that any future dealing with them would be a headache. Days passed, and I thought maybe it was a misunderstanding that would quickly fade. But right as I was beginning to forget the incident, a letter arrived in my mailbox. The envelope had some official-looking logo slapped on it, the name of the local HOA. Inside was a typed statement with a stern warning about unauthorized modifications to property exterior and non-compliant use of neighborhood amenities. To my surprise, the letter also included a reference to my pool. Now I'd been enjoying my pool since I moved in, a small rectangle in the backyard with a wooden deck that the previous owner installed. I was minding my business and not imposing on anyone else. The letter claimed I needed to shut it down and submit a request for pool usage because communal pools are governed by HOA guidelines. I practically laughed out loud. My pool is not part of any communal amenity. It's fenced in on my private property, and I sure didn't sign anything with them. I decided to ignore the letter, suspecting they'd realize their error sooner or later. The real trouble started when I continued to use my pool as usual. On weekends, I would invite friends over for a barbecue or just to hang out around the deck. Sometimes my sister, Caitlin, would bring her kids to splash around. They loved the shallow section, and I always watched them closely to ensure safety. The moment I heard the kids shrieking in delight, I noticed that same group of people in matching polos. Some of them looked suspiciously like Eleonora's crew, observing from across the street or skulking near the neighbor's hedge. One time, Eleonora herself marched right up to my fence and shouted in my direction, "You need to close this unauthorized pool immediately." When I politely told her to mind her own business, she glared at me and stomped off. A few weeks went by and the tension simmered. But then came the day I will never forget. The HOA called 911 while I was having a simple afternoon swim. It was a sunny Saturday with a slight breeze, and I was in the backyard enjoying the pool for the first time in a week. I had been working a tough schedule at my job, so this was my time to unwind. Out of nowhere, I heard sirens approaching. At first, I thought there might have been a traffic accident nearby, but then I heard voices at my front door and the telltale signs of commotion. I grabbed a towel and rushed around the side gate. Sure enough, 2 police officers were standing on my porch looking somewhat perplexed. and behind them stood Eleonora and two other HOA members, arms folded, faces tight with indignation. "Is there an emergency, ma'am?" one officer asked me politely. Confused, I replied, "Not that I know of. I'm just swimming in my backyard." That's when Eleonora piped up, claiming I was violating neighborhood regulations and refusing to leave a private community pool. The officers took a moment to process this conflicting information. I explained, as calmly as possible, that it was my property and I wasn't part of any HOA. One officer pulled me aside while the other asked Eleonora to step back. After verifying my identification and my property records, I keep copies of relevant documents in a home binder for easy access. It became glaringly clear that Eleonora and her cronies had placed a bogus emergency call. To say the officers were frustrated would be putting it lightly. They lectured Eleonora right there, informing her that 911 is for emergencies, not petty disputes. She tried to defend herself, saying she was worried about an unauthorized individual trespassing in the community, but the officer shook his head, emphasizing that false reports are taken seriously. After jotting down notes, they gave me a small nod and left. Eleonora and her associates also retreated, but not before uttering something about not being done with me yet. I was livid, but I also felt somewhat victorious that the police sided with me, especially when they made it clear the HOA had wasted their time. Still, that incident triggered a decision in me. I wasn't going to let them push me around. I had half a mind to contact a lawyer right then and there, but I decided first to gather evidence of harassment. For the next few weeks, I installed small security cameras around my front yard, side gate, and backyard fence. It wasn't exactly cheap, but it felt necessary. I also kept a detailed log of any time an HOA member confronted me or left me threatening notes. You wouldn't believe the range of ridiculous letters I received, from accusations that my pool parties were disruptive to the neighborhood environment, to claims that I owed back dues for an organization I never joined. On top of that, I discovered a new complication. The HOA had started placing fines on my property address, sending official-looking documents with escalating dollar amounts. They insisted that I was in violation of multiple articles in their covenant. In one particularly absurd notice, they claimed to have the authority to put a lien on my house if I didn't pay up. Now, anyone with knowledge of real estate law knows they can't do that if I'm not actually part of their association. Nonetheless, it was alarming to think they were trying to trick me into paying these fines. My older brother Jonas is a pretty savvy researcher, so I asked for his help. We scoured the county's public records, verifying that my property was definitely excluded from the HOA. We even downloaded the original maps, the amended zoning files, and the association's bylaws. Everything confirmed that I was in the clear. Jonas, being quite thorough, also read up on harassment laws in our state. He suggested I consult a real estate attorney to see if I had grounds for a legal case against the HOA for repeated harassment. I decided that, before escalating things to a lawsuit, I'd try a face-to-face approach. Maybe if I went to their board meeting and explained the facts, cooler heads would prevail. It turns out they held open board meetings on the first Monday of every month in a small conference room at a local event space. Jonas offered to come with me, but I felt it might look hostile if I showed up with an entourage, so I attended alone. The minute I stepped inside, I felt a wave of hostility from several individuals I recognized. Eleonora was at the head of a small table, flanked by her associates. I politely waited until new business was introduced. When I raised my hand to speak, Eleonora barely concealed her annoyance. I calmly explained the situation, showing documents that proved my property was not under HOA jurisdiction. I politely requested they remove any outstanding fines, stop the harassment, and leave me alone. Eleonora listened, but her face went from irritated to downright offended. She insisted her records were accurate and implied that I was trying to wriggle out of basic neighborly responsibilities. I tried to maintain my composure, stating once again that I never signed any agreement. Then, someone else at the table, a soft-spoken man named Everett, looked genuinely puzzled and asked if maybe there was a mistake in the association's boundary paperwork. He wanted to see the documents I had. I handed them over and he scanned them, eyebrows shooting up. I could see a hint of realization there, that I was telling the truth. But before he could speak, Eleonora basically snatched the papers away. She declared that she needed to review them in private and ended the discussion abruptly. I left that meeting fuming. Only a few days later, I found my front gate plastered with a red sign that read, "Pool closed, violation of safety regulations. in huge block letters. The sign was covered in the HOA's emblem. I was shocked. This was clearly a new escalated step in their harassment campaign. They were now attempting to scare my neighbors, framing me as some kind of public hazard. Since I'd had my property inspected before I even bought it, I knew there were no violations. I also knew the association had zero authority to regulate my pool, let alone close it. So I took down the sign, carefully stored it as evidence, and emailed my attorney. That same night, my friend Stacy, who works in local news, told me that the best course might be to file a complaint for harassment or, at the very least, a cease and desist. She offered to put me in touch with a legal contact who specialized in homeowner disputes. Eager to stop the madness, I scheduled an appointment with that attorney the following week. We had a long discussion, reviewed all my evidence, and concluded that a strongly worded cease and desist letter might be an effective first step. If the HOA didn't back down, a lawsuit was definitely on the table. About 2 weeks passed and everything seemed calm. No more notes, no more signs, no more uninvited visits. I thought maybe the attorney's letter scared them off. I was finally able to enjoy my pool in peace. I even threw a small gathering for my mother's birthday, complete with a cookout and a slip and slide for the kids. Everyone had a wonderful time, and there were no confrontations. I started to let my guard down. Then, one evening, I came home from a late-night shift to find 2 strange men standing in my backyard, shining flashlights at my pool. I nearly dropped my car keys in shock. When I approached them, they introduced themselves as contractors supposedly sent by the association to inspect a crack in the pool foundation. They claimed it was a safety hazard. I asked if they had any legal documentation granting them access to my property. They had nothing. No written permission, no official government license to conduct an inspection, not a single valid piece of paper. Furious, I demanded they leave immediately, or I'd call the police. The men left in a hurry, looking rattled and muttering something about "we only do what we're told." This was trespassing, plain and simple, and I had the entire encounter recorded on my security cameras. That was the last straw. I compiled all my evidence, including the video footage of trespassers, the false emergency call, the threatening letters, the bogus fines, the sign forcibly taped to my gate, and my property records. Then, with my attorney's guidance, I filed a formal complaint with both the local police department and the civil court. We were prepared to argue that the HOA, through its board members, had repeatedly engaged in harassment and trespassing, and had also filed false claims with local authorities. My attorney warned me these cases can drag on for months, but the idea was to pressure them into a settlement that required them to acknowledge they had no authority over my home. About a month in, the HOA responded through their own attorney. They tried to angle it like I was the combative one, ignoring community standards, but they didn't have a shred of documentation to prove I was part of their association. Meanwhile, I had official property records, plus statements from the previous homeowner. We also had evidence of their harassment and trespassing. It was an open and shut case. Rather than drag it out, the association's attorney floated the idea of mediation to avoid a costly trial. My attorney and I agreed, provided the HOA board members come to the table prepared to apologize and rescind all claims against me. The mediation session took place in a small conference room at a law office downtown. Eleonora, predictably, was there, looking livid and offended by the entire ordeal. 2 other HOA board members accompanied her, both appearing uneasy. My attorney calmly laid out the evidence, piece by piece, making it clear that we had them pinned for harassment and that their claims had no legal standing. Eleonora tried to argue that everyone in the neighborhood was automatically part of the association by virtue of living there. But once again, the property lines told a different story. The mediator, a calm and seasoned professional, looked unimpressed by Eleonora's explanations and asked if she had any documents to refute ours. She didn't. She only muttered that the HOA had an old charter that included my parcel, yet she couldn't produce it. At one point, Everett, the same board member who seemed reasonable at the earlier meeting, spoke up. He conceded that they had found a note in the HOA's older documents that indicated my property had been annexed out of the association long ago due to a boundary realignment. He seemed genuinely apologetic, almost embarrassed by how far things had gone. The mediator picked up on his statement and noted that this alone provided an avenue for the HOA to settle. My attorney then spelled out the terms. The HOA would issue a written statement confirming they had no right to collect fees, regulate my property, or enforce their rules on me. They would also pay a nominal sum to cover part of my legal fees and compensate me for the harassment. If they refused, we would proceed to court. Eleonora looked like she wanted to protest, but the other board members glanced in her direction, and I sensed they'd had enough of her vendetta. Ultimately, they agreed to the mediator's suggestion and signed the settlement. I left with a wave of relief, yet part of me still wondered if Eleonora might try something else eventually. Regardless, it was a victory for me, and I felt a newfound appreciation for property rights. In the days following the mediation, the HOA mailed me a brief letter of apology, marked "on behalf of the board," and a check to cover most of my legal expenses. They also promised to strike any references to my property from their files. I considered that a hard-earned win, and for a while, things returned to normal. I resumed my backyard swims without interruption, enjoyed quiet Sunday mornings on my deck, and savored the knowledge that I'd set a precedent in our area. The HOA couldn't just decide they ruled over properties that had never agreed to join them. Friends dropped by more often, joking that my pool parties were now officially sanctioned by the powers that be, and we all had a good laugh. Life was smooth sailing until my doorbell rang one Saturday, and I found a local building inspector politely waiting on my porch. He apologized for showing up unannounced, but mentioned he had been contacted by concerned members of the neighborhood about unpermitted structures. In disbelief, I led him around the property, explaining that everything was already approved before I even bought the house. The inspector smiled sympathetically. He found no issues whatsoever, commended me on my well-maintained pool and backyard, and left. I couldn't prove it, but I was convinced Eleonora had orchestrated this. Clearly, she or some of her loyal followers still carried a grudge. Rather than escalate again, I decided to secure an additional line of defense. I reached out to a city council member I'd recently met at a neighborhood event, someone neutral, with knowledge of local zoning rules. In a short email, I explained the situation, attached my property records, and asked for advice. That council member replied promptly, assuring me that I was in the right, and that if the HOA continued to harass me, I could file a formal complaint with the city's code enforcement office. They even offered to forward my email to the relevant city department as a heads up. Feeling emboldened, I let the matter rest for the time being, hoping it wouldn't come to that. Thankfully, the building inspector's visit turned out to be the final attempt from Eleonora's camp, for the time being. A couple of months rolled by with no new drama. A wave of relief washed over me as I finally felt that I could breathe easy. I left my security cameras running just in case. During that calm period, a few neighbors actually came by to chat. While some had no idea about the dispute, others had heard rumors that the HOA was stepping outside its authority. One neighbor, a sweet older gentleman named Peter, expressed sympathy. He said Eleonora had a reputation for bulldozing people into submission and was known for targeting folks she didn't like. It was oddly reassuring to learn I wasn't the only one who had dealt with her stubborn, authoritarian style. Then came a fascinating twist. One of Eleonora's close neighbors, a new arrival in the community named Marcus, allegedly caught her dumping tree clippings and debris over his fence after she demanded he remove a perfectly healthy maple tree in his yard. Marcus installed a trail camera and captured her tossing cut branches across the property line late one night. He ended up filing a complaint with the city's Waste Enforcement Division. This little drama erupted at an HOA meeting, so I'm told, and caused quite a stir. It seemed Eleonora's iron grip on the neighborhood was slipping. Several board members who had quietly tolerated her behavior for years were now questioning whether her brand of enforcement was doing more harm than good. Word on the street was that Eleonora faced strong calls to step down as the HOA president. People realized that her confrontational methods had put the association in potential legal jeopardy. After all, they'd just signed a settlement with me that included restitution for harassment. And now, with a second complaint on record due to Eleonora's antics, the board was understandably concerned about a pattern of misconduct. I heard rumors of a special session to vote on her removal from the board. Although I wasn't part of that community, gossip travels fast in a suburban neighborhood. I can't say I was sad to hear about her downfall. Eventually, I received confirmation from Everett, the board member who seemed somewhat reasonable. He popped by my house unexpectedly one afternoon while I was watering the front garden. He apologized for any lingering tensions and let me know Eleonora had officially been voted out of her position. She was still a resident, but no longer the president of the HOA, and had been replaced by a more level-headed individual. He assured me that no one from the new board was interested in going after my property anymore, and in fact, they intended to revise their official neighborhood boundaries to properly reflect which houses were actually in the association. I thanked him politely, though part of me wanted to say, "Took you long enough." Meanwhile, the story of how the HOA called 911 on me had become something of a neighborhood legend. Friends in the community joked that I should call the local paper for an interview, but that's not really my style. I was content to let the drama settle and focus on enjoying my home. With Eleonora out of power, I no longer worried about surprise visits or random finds. My camera system continued to capture nothing more than the occasional raccoon or stray cat wandering by. You might think the tale ends there, but there was one more twist. About 6 months after Eleonora's ousting, I received a phone call from a real estate agent who specialized in the local market. She told me she represented a couple who was very interested in buying a home on my street, but was wary of the HOA. She explained that they'd heard a rumor about a property that was exempt, which meant no association fees or rules. Curious, they wanted to see if I'd consider selling. The offer was quite generous, and I admit it made me pause. I had grown attached to my house, especially after fighting so hard for my right to enjoy it free from HOA meddling. But the idea of moving to a place where I could start fresh without any leftover resentment from certain neighbors was tempting. I invited the agent over to view my place just to gauge their seriousness. The couple loved the home, the yard, and especially the pool. They acknowledged that they wanted no part of any association and didn't mind being a sort of lone wolf property in the neighborhood. After a week of back and forth, they made me a firm offer that was significantly higher than what I paid. It's not every day you get an opportunity like that. I considered my options carefully. Part of me wanted to stay and enjoy the fruits of my labor. I'd effectively beaten the HOA in a dispute and would likely never be bothered again, but I also recognized a fantastic financial opportunity when I saw one. Ultimately, I decided to accept the offer. I reasoned that while I loved my home, the specter of Eleonora and her misguided vendetta left a lingering stain. Plus, I could move closer to my sister Caitlin, which would make family get-togethers easier. So I sold the house, made a tidy profit, and moved a few miles away to a more laid-back neighborhood. Before leaving, I gave the new owners every single document I had: property records, letters from the HOA, even a copy of the settlement, so they'd have proof at the ready if the association ever tried to meddle again. 2 weeks after the sale went through, I took one last drive through my old street. My car was loaded with a few final boxes I'd stored in the garage. Looking at my former home, I felt a mixture of nostalgia and relief. That pool, once the center of an absurd power struggle, now belonged to new owners who understood their rights and wouldn't let anyone push them around. The front yard was pristine, and the dwarf shrubs I'd planted had blossomed beautifully. My security cameras were still visible along the eaves. I left them as part of the deal, ensuring the new owners had the same protective measures. I smiled, thinking about the ridiculousness of how it all started. The day the HOA called 911 because I was swimming in my own pool. As I passed the exit from the subdivision, I noticed a smaller sign reading, "You are now leaving the HOA boundaries. Please observe all posted regulations." I chuckled. It seemed a fitting little irony that the association was forced to make their boundary lines clearer after what happened. I also wondered how Eleonora was coping with her loss of power. Perhaps she'd learned a lesson in overstepping her bounds. Then again, maybe not. In the end, I walked away with more than just a nice real estate profit. I discovered a newfound appreciation for standing up to intimidation. In a country where private property rights are so deeply rooted in the law, it's astonishing how quickly some individuals try to bully others into complying with non-existent regulations. The whole ordeal taught me that knowledge truly is power. Had I not done my due diligence with property records and sought legal counsel, who knows how far the HOA's harassment might have gone. I also gained a healthy perspective on communities governed by homeowner associations. I learned that while many HOAs do good work, like maintaining common areas and enforcing genuine safety standards, others can be run by people who let power go to their heads. This experience proved to me that no matter how official or intimidating someone's letterhead may be, it doesn't override actual law. And in a showdown between an overzealous HOA and a homeowner armed with facts, the homeowner can prevail. So that's the story of how I once had the police show up at my door while I was just taking a peaceful swim in my own private pool. The big mistake the HOA made was assuming everyone on my street was automatically under their rule. They had no idea who they were messing with. I wasn't one to cave in when I knew the law was on my side. It led to months of frustration, multiple confrontations, and even a legal proceeding. But in the end, the HOA members who repeatedly violated my rights faced the consequences. Eleonora lost her position, they paid for my legal fees, and they had to issue a formal statement acknowledging their error. And eventually, I moved on to a better situation, armed with a sense of victory and a bit more wisdom in dealing with neighborhood politics. I'll never forget that surreal moment when I opened my door and saw the police standing there, all because the HOA decided to call 911 on me for swimming in my own pool. Looking back, I might laugh at the absurdity of it, but at the time it was anything but amusing. Now, whenever a friend is house hunting and asks me about HOAs, I share my story as a cautionary tale. Do your research, be confident in your rights, and don't let yourself be bullied, I tell them. You never know when a power-hungry group might try to impose rules that don't apply to you, hoping you'll just give in. Thankfully, I stood my ground and found the best possible outcome, even if it took a roller coaster ride to get there. Friends, thank you. See you soon.